The moment Gertrude Lawson walked into the Dusty Creek General Store with mud on her boots and fire in her gray eyes, Theodore Doyle knew that whatever quiet life he had been building for himself in the Arizona Territory was about to become considerably more complicated. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Calico Bend sat at the edge of the Sonoran Desert like a stubborn splinter lodged in the skin of the earth. It was a town that had grown up fast and mean, the way most towns did after the Southern Pacific Railroad began threading itself through the territory, dragging with it a tide of hopeful settlers, desperate gamblers, ambitious merchants, and men of questionable character who found that the vastness of the desert made an excellent place to lose old debts and old names. The red rock ridges that circled the town on three sides caught the afternoon light and turned it gold and copper, and the dust that rose from the main street never quite settled, drifting instead through every doorway and window like a permanent reminder that the land here did not belong to anyone, no matter how many deeds were filed in the county courthouse. Theodore Doyle had arrived in Calico Bend 6 months prior, having ridden down from Colorado after a season of cattle driving that left him with enough coin to stable his horse, rent a modest room above the barber shop, and spend his mornings doing odd jobs around town while he figured out what came next. He was 28 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who had spent their formative years working with their hands, with dark hair that curled at his collar when it grew too long and eyes the color of deep creek water in the shade, somewhere between green and brown, shifting with the light. He was not a man who spoke unnecessarily. The other men in town had learned this about him quickly and had come to respect it, because in Calico Bend, a man who chose his words carefully was a man who had learned something worth knowing about the world. He was standing at the far end of the counter that afternoon, having just delivered a crate of lumber to old Mr. Hankins, the storekeeper, when the door swung open and Gertrude Lawson stepped inside. She was 24 years old, though she carried herself with a composure that suggested she had accumulated considerably more experience than her years accounted for. She was not a small woman, standing nearly to Theodore's shoulder, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days and a traveling dress of deep green wool that was practical rather than fashionable. Her face was all strong angles and quiet determination, with a mouth that seemed shaped for both stubbornness and sudden, unexpected laughter. The mud on her boots, Theodore noticed, was the particular red clay mud of the Eastern Pass, which meant she had ridden in from a considerable distance and had likely been traveling for at least 2 days. She moved to the counter and pulled a folded paper from inside her coat, smoothing it flat on the worn wood surface before addressing Mr. Hankins. "I'm looking for the Lawson homestead," she said. "My father's property. I have the deed here. I was told in Tucson that someone in this town would know the location." Her voice was low and clear, the kind of voice that did not strain itself to be heard but expected you to listen regardless. There was the faint trace of a Missouri accent in it, just enough to tell you where she had started from without telling you anything about where she had been since. Mr. Hankins, who was a wiry, deeply tanned man of 60 with a magnificent set of side whiskers, peered at the deed and then peered at her over the top of his spectacles. "Lawson," he said. "That would be Edmund Lawson's place, out on the eastern flat past the second ridge." The woman's expression shifted very slightly. "My father passed away 4 months ago. The property came to me. I intend to work it." Theodore was not trying to eavesdrop. The store was simply not large enough to provide any alternative. He watched as she tucked the deed back into her coat with a practiced, careful motion, and asked Mr. Hankins about purchasing seed and some basic provisions. She counted out her money with a precision that told him she was watching every cent, and she did not hesitate over the prices even though he could see from her expression that they were higher than she had expected. He helped Mr. Hankins carry her supplies to the wagon she had tied outside without being asked, because it was the obvious and sensible thing to do. and because 2 wooden crates of grain and a full sack of cornmeal were simply more than one person ought to wrestle alone. She looked at him steadily when he set the second crate in the wagon bed. "I didn't ask for help," she said, but there was no hostility in it. It was simply a statement of fact. "No," he agreed, "you didn't." He touched the brim of his hat and went back inside to collect the payment. Mr. Hankins owed him for the lumber delivery, and he did not watch her drive away, though he was aware of the particular quality of silence that settled over the street after the wagon wheels had carried her around the far corner and out of sight. He thought about her twice more that evening, and told himself both times that it was simply because she was a newcomer to a small town, and newcomers were naturally interesting for a day or two. He did not entirely believe himself. The Lawson homestead, as it turned out, was in considerably worse condition than anyone had seen fit to mention to Gertrude before she arrived. The house itself was a low adobe structure with a good roof but 2 broken windows, a collapsed section of fence along the eastern boundary, a well that needed its pulley mechanism replaced, and soil that had been left fallow so long it was going to require serious working before it would accept any seed worth planting. She discovered all of this in the first 3 days and made a list of every problem in a small leather notebook, with the kind of methodical calm that came from having made many such lists in circumstances that offered even fewer resources. Gertrude had not grown up soft. Her mother had died of fever when she was 11, and her father, Edmund Lawson, a man of considerable ambition and inconsistent luck, had moved them from Missouri to Kansas to New Mexico, and finally to the Arizona Territory in pursuit of various opportunities that had each, in turn, revealed themselves to be somewhat less golden than advertised. He had been a man she loved and a man who had frustrated her in approximately equal measure, and when the letter came informing her that he had died of a heart attack in Tucson, she had cried for 3 days and then packed her belongings and come to claim what was legally hers. She was not entirely without resources. She had spent the previous 2 years working as a school teacher in Santa Fe, and she had saved carefully. She also had a fierce practical intelligence, strong hands, and a deeply held conviction that the land her father had acquired, whatever its current state, was workable if a person was willing to work it. She intended to be that person. The first week she repaired the windows herself, using oilskin stretched tight over the frames until she could afford glass. She patched the fence with wire she had purchased in town. She cleared the well mechanism and replaced the rotted rope, and she began turning the soil in the nearest field with a hand plow, working in the cool hours of morning and evening when the desert sun was not actively trying to lay her flat. She went to town twice that first week for supplies, and both times saw the tall, quiet cowboy who had helped her with the crates without being asked. The first time he was outside the livery stable brushing down a paint horse with practiced, even strokes. The second time he was sitting on the steps of the barber shop with a cup of coffee, reading a newspaper with the focused attention of a man who read because he genuinely wanted to know what was in the newspaper rather than because he had nothing else to do. Both times he acknowledged her with a nod of his hat and nothing more. She appreciated this. She was not in Calico Bend to make friends or to attract attention. She was here to build something. It was on her 3rd week in town, when she came in specifically to speak with the county land agent about a boundary dispute she had discovered in her father's paperwork, that things became unexpectedly complicated. The land agent's name was Rupert Claiborne, and he was a wide, florid man in his 40s who wore a vest that strained its buttons, and had the particular manner of someone who had spent many years in a position of minor authority and had allowed it to construct his entire personality. He looked at the paperwork she presented, looked at her, and then smiled in a way that she immediately recognized as the smile of a man who has decided in advance that a woman's concerns are a nuisance. "Miss Lawson," he said, "your father did acquire that parcel, that's true enough, but there's a complication. The complication, as he explained it over the next 20 minutes, was that a man named Gerald Fitch had filed a competing claim on 20 acres of the eastern portion of the Lawson property, arguing that Edmund Lawson had verbally agreed to sell it to him before his death. The claim was unsupported by any written agreement, which Gertrude pointed out immediately and firmly. Claiborne agreed that this was technically accurate, but suggested that these things had a way of becoming complicated in territorial court, and that perhaps a sensible resolution might be found if she were willing to discuss the matter with Mr. Fitch directly. Something in the way he said this made her very still. "And who exactly is Gerald Fitch?" she asked. "A substantial landowner in this county," Claiborne said, in a tone that implied this information should settle the matter. She left his office without settling anything and stood for a moment in the afternoon sun with her hat pulled low and her jaw set in a way that several people passing on the boardwalk correctly identified as a woman who was deciding between several unpleasant courses of action. She had heard the name Gerald Fitch. She had heard it from Mr. Hankins and from the woman at the dry goods store and from the man who ran the feed supply at the edge of town. Fitch owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He had money, influence, and the kind of long-established relationships with county officials that tended to make legal complications resolve themselves in predictable directions. He was also, by every account she had gathered, a man in his 50s who was recently widowed and who had developed a habit of paying particular attention to women who found themselves in financially uncertain situations. She was beginning to understand what was being suggested to her, and the understanding made her want to do something she generally considered beneath her dignity, which was to hit someone with her hat. Instead, she went to see Mr. Hankins, because she had discovered in her short time in Calico Bend that the storekeeper was the most reliable source of actual information in a town where rumor traveled faster than fact. Theodore Doyle was there again. He seemed, she was beginning to notice, to have a particular genius for being present in locations where things of significance were about to happen, though he never gave any indication of being aware of this gift. He was repairing a broken shelf bracket at the back of the store when she came in, working with a screwdriver, and a level with the steady attention he brought to everything physical. He looked up when she entered, assessed her expression with one brief glance, and returned to his work. Mr. Hankins listened to her account of the meeting with Claiborne and sucked air through his teeth in the manner of a man who is not surprised but is genuinely sorry about it. "Fitch has been making moves on various properties along the eastern flat for 2 years, he said. "He wants the water rights that come with the land. Your father's parcel sits right on top of the best underground spring in that section of the county. He has no legal claim," Gertrude said. "No," Hankins agreed. "But he has a great deal of patience and a lawyer in Tucson who charges more per hour than most men in this town earn in a month." She was quiet for a moment. Theodore, at the back of the store, did not appear to be listening, but she had the distinct sense that he heard every word. "What would you suggest?" she asked Hankins. "I'd suggest finding yourself someone who knows the territory and knows the law," he said carefully. "And I'd suggest doing it before Fitch arranges a formal meeting with you, because that meeting will not be what it appears to be." She bought the things she needed, said good evening to Mr. Hankins, and turned to find Theodore Doyle standing 3 feet away with the level in his hand and the shelf bracket repaired, and an expression on his face that was not quite a question but was close to one. "You know the territory," she said, because she had already assessed him and because she did not believe in wasting time when a direct approach was available. "Well enough," he said, "and the law, better than some." She studied him for a moment. He was steady under the examination in a way that she found, despite herself, quite calming. "Doyle," Hankins supplied from behind the counter. "Theodore Doyle. He spent 4 years as a deputy marshal up in Colorado before he came south." This was information that rearranged several things in her assessment. "I'm not asking for charity," she said to Theodore. I can pay for guidance, not lavishly but fairly. I don't need paying, he said, but I'm not going to interfere in something you haven't asked me to interfere in. She looked at him for one more long moment. I am asking, she said, professionally, as a business arrangement. He nodded once. All right. This was how it began, not with romance or with any sense of anything other than necessity, at least on the surface. She needed someone who understood how this territory worked, and who could help her navigate a situation that was shaping up to be significantly more complex than a simple land claim. He offered his assistance in the practical, unhurried manner of a man who had decided a thing was worth doing, and did not feel the need to elaborate on his reasons. He rode out to the property with her the following morning, and spent several hours walking the boundary lines, reading her father's paperwork with the focused attention of someone who understood legal documents, and talking to her about what she had and what could be challenged and what could not. He knew the county clerk, he explained, and 2 of the 3 judges who presided over the territorial court in Tucson, and he had a passing familiarity with Fitch's lawyer that came from a legal dispute 2 years prior in Colorado that had, in the end, gone in the right direction. She found, as the morning stretched into afternoon, and they sat at the rough wooden table inside her adobe house, drinking the strong coffee she had brewed on the iron stove, that he was remarkably easy to think alongside. He did not interrupt. He did not attempt to simplify his explanations in the manner of someone who had decided in advance that she could not follow complex reasoning. He asked sharp questions and listened to her answers with the kind of focused attention that she had rarely experienced from anyone, let alone from a man she had known for approximately 72 hours. He noticed things. While she was explaining the boundary markers her father had described in his notes, he was simultaneously cataloging the state of the homestead with quick, systematic glances, taking in the repaired fence and the new rope on the well and the turned soil in the field and the oilskin windows without ever quite pausing in the conversation to remark on any of it. She caught him doing this and said, "You can say it." "Say what?" "Whatever observation you're making." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that whoever has been working this place has done it right," he said. "Starting with the well and the fence before the field, that's the correct order." She looked at him steadily. "It's my place," she said. "I'm the one who's been working it." "I know," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of it, in the absence of surprise or qualified praise, that made her feel something she was not prepared to examine immediately. They established a pattern over the following weeks that was, on its surface, entirely businesslike. He came to the homestead every 2 or 3 days to report on his progress with the legal situation, which involved a series of letters to the county clerk, a formal challenge filed against Fitch's competing claim, and a trip to Tucson that he undertook alone and returned from looking slightly grim around the eyes but fundamentally determined. "Fitch's lawyer is trying to argue verbal contract," he told her on his return. "It won't hold in court, but they're going to drag it out long enough to cost you money you may not have." "How long?" 3 months, possibly 4. She calculated this in the way she calculated everything, practically and without flinching. "I can manage 4 months if the harvest comes in. The spring planting is already in," he said, which was true because he had helped her with it the previous week, not as part of any arrangement but because he had arrived at the property on a morning when she was struggling with a section of particularly stubborn soil, and had simply picked up the second plow without discussion. She had not asked him to. He had not explained himself. They had worked the field together for 4 hours with a companionable efficiency that she had found deeply, unexpectedly moving in a way she had not wanted to think about too carefully at the time. She was not someone who was easily moved. She was not someone who permitted herself to be swept away by sentiment or proximity. She had grown up moving too often and losing too much to allow herself to depend heavily on any single person or circumstance. She had learned to be sufficient to herself, and she had been, consistently and with considerable success. This was why the slow, incremental warmth that she was developing for Theodore Doyle was, in her private assessment a problem. She was not in Calico Bend to fall in love. She was here to build a life on land that was legally hers, and that she intended to make productive and permanent. Love was a complication she did not need, particularly the kind of love she could feel developing, the kind that was not a sudden storm but a slow deepening, the kind that arrived not through grand gestures but through the accumulated weight of small moments. Small moments like the one where he arrived at the homestead early one morning to find her trying to fix the irrigation channel on the north field, and simply waded in without being asked and worked with her through 2 hours of muddy, tedious trench digging, with the matter-of-fact willingness of someone who thought this was simply what you did when there was work that needed doing and you were present. Or the afternoon when the dust storm came in from the west and they both ran to get the livestock into the shelter she had built against the back wall of the house. And in the chaos of shutting everything down and getting inside before the red wall of dust hit them, they ended up standing very close together in the narrow doorway, and she looked up at him and saw in his expression something that was quickly and carefully composed back into neutrality, but which she had seen nonetheless. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself he was simply a decent man who helped people because that was his character, not because she was specifically the person he wanted to help. She told herself many things. One evening in late April, she rode into town for the weekly supplies and stopped at the saloon to speak with the bartender, whose name was Pete Walcott, and who had turned out to be an unexpectedly good source of information about Fitch's movements and intentions. Fitch had apparently been telling people around town that the Lawson land dispute was nearly resolved, which meant he was either more confident than he should have been, or he was planning something that hadn't become visible yet. She was standing at the end of the bar speaking with Pete in a low, businesslike manner when the door opened and Gerald Fitch walked in. He was precisely what she had expected from the account she had gathered, a large, heavy man with silver hair and the kind of expensive coat that announced wealth without quite managing elegance. He had small eyes that moved quickly around a room and a smile that arrived and departed too efficiently to be genuine. He came directly to where she was standing as though he had known she would be there, which made her wonder who had told him. He introduced himself with the expansive confidence of someone who expected his name to produce a particular effect, and then expressed, at considerable and practiced length, his sympathy about her father's passing, his admiration for her courage in taking on the property alone, and his desire to be helpful in whatever way he could. She listened to all of this with a polite expression and said nothing until he had finished. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I understand you have a claim filed against 20 acres of my property." He waved this away as though it were a minor misunderstanding. "A formality," he said, "something that can be resolved very easily between reasonable people. I'd like to invite you to dinner at my home this coming Saturday so that we can discuss it in a civilized setting." She understood immediately that the dinner was not about the land. The dinner was about being inside Gerald Fitch's house, at his table, in his territory, surrounded by his things, where the balance of power was arranged in his favor, and where a conversation could be steered in directions that would be very difficult to steer back from. "That's very kind," she said. "But I don't think a private dinner is the appropriate setting for a legal discussion." He smiled again with that quick, practiced efficiency. "I assure you, Miss Lawson, my intentions are entirely Gertrude." The voice came from behind her right shoulder, close but not crowding, calm but carrying. She turned to find Theodore standing there with his hat in his hand, and his coffee-dark eyes moving from her to Fitch with an expression that was entirely pleasant and entirely unmistakable. "Pardon the interruption," he said to Fitch, in the tone of someone who was not remotely pardoning anything. "I wanted to make sure you had heard about the response that was filed with the county clerk yesterday regarding the competing claim. Judge Alderman is going to be reviewing it personally." He paused. "I rode up to speak with him in Tucson on Tuesday. He sends his regards." Fitch's smile underwent a subtle but significant adjustment. Theodore turned to Gertrude then, and the quality of his attention shifted in a way she felt physically, like a change in the temperature of the air. "Are you ready to head back? I've got that fence section I wanted to finish before dark." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and unhurried, with a question in his eyes that had nothing to do with the fence. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." They walked out together into the evening air, and she waited until they had reached the horses before she said, quietly and without accusation, "I did not need rescuing." "No," he agreed, checking the cinch on his saddle with one hand. "You had it perfectly well handled. Then why did you come in?" He was quiet for a long moment. The evening light was turning the dust on the street to something almost beautiful, the kind of amber that you only saw in the desert at this particular hour, and he looked at the horses rather than at her, which made what he said next feel more honest than if he had looked her in the eye. "Because I was walking past and I saw his horse tied out front and I knew he was in there and I know what kind of man he is," he said. "And I thought I wanted to be sure you had someone with you, not to step in, just to be there." She stood very still for a moment. "You were watching out for me," she said. "I was nearby," he said, which was, she understood, the closest he was likely to come to admitting anything. She untied her horse and swung up into the saddle and looked down at him from that height for a moment. "Theodore," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for being nearby." Something moved in his expression and was carefully, privately settled back into place. "Any time," he said. The weeks that followed were the kind that a person recognizes only in retrospect as the most significant weeks of their life. The ones where everything is still ordinary on the surface, but something fundamental is shifting underneath. The way a river changes its course slowly and inevitably beneath a landscape that appears unchanged. He was at the homestead more often now, in ways that were always technically purposeful but which had developed a quality of comfortable regularity that both of them were carefully not commenting on. He helped her run the fence line and string the new wire she had ordered from Tucson. He identified a problem with the way the drainage was set on the north side of the house that would cause flooding come the monsoon season, and helped her regrade it. He brought her a copy of the territorial water rights statutes from the county courthouse, and sat with her at the kitchen table working through the relevant sections in the pale gold light of the oil lamp. She discovered things about him gradually, the way you discover things about a landscape, by traveling through it slowly rather than viewing it from a distance. He had grown up in Tennessee, the second son of a farming family, and had gone west at 19 following a brother who had subsequently died of cholera in Colorado. And he had stayed on partly because going back felt like a retreat, and partly because the western landscape had done something to him that he had never quite been able to articulate, but which had made the idea of any other place feel insufficient. He had been a deputy marshal for 4 years in a mining town outside Denver, and he had left that position not because of any failure or disgrace, but because he had come, gradually and with great certainty, to the conclusion that the law and justice were related but not identical, and he needed to be in a place where he could act according to his own judgment rather than according to a badge. She told him about Santa Fe and about teaching, about the particular satisfaction of watching a child's face at the moment when a concept clicked into place. She told him about her father with the complex, honest affection of someone who had loved a person fully while also seeing them clearly, and he listened to this with the kind of attention that honored both the love and the clarity without trying to reconcile them into something simpler than they were. She told him about the man in Santa Fe. She did not plan to tell him this. It came out one evening when they were sitting on the narrow porch in front of the adobe house watching the last light leave the sky, and he had said something about the way people in difficult circumstances sometimes accepted arrangements that they would not otherwise have accepted, and she had said, without entirely meaning to, that she understood that better than she wished to. He waited. "There was a man in Santa Fe," she said. "A prominent man." He wanted to marry me, and I had an understanding with him for about 8 months. We were not formally engaged, but it was expected. By both of us, I thought." She stopped. "What happened?" he asked. "He married the daughter of a banker from St. Louis," she said, "while I was still operating under the understanding that we had an understanding." She said this with the dry steadiness of someone who had processed the humiliation thoroughly and arrived on the other side of it with their dignity intact, though the effort that had required was still faintly visible if you knew how to look. "I'm sorry," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of any attempt to reframe it or minimize it or offer a silver lining, was the most useful response anyone had offered her on the subject. "It clarified a great deal," she said, "about what I want and what I'm willing to accept." "Which is?" She looked at the darkening sky. "Honesty," she said, "and someone who means what they say." He was quiet for a long moment. "That seems like a reasonable standard," he said at last. "I think so," she agreed. The conversation moved on to other things, but something in the air between them had shifted again. That slow, tectonic movement that she was both aware of and uncertain how to address, because she had been wrong before about what she thought she understood, and she had no interest in being wrong in the same way twice. May came in hot and bright, and the spring planting was showing well, and the legal challenge against Fitch's claim was proceeding in a direction that Theodore reported with cautious optimism. Judge Alderman had apparently made his views on the matter quite clear to Fitch's lawyer in a meeting that had lasted less than 20 minutes, which was itself a signal of sorts. It was on a Saturday in the middle of May that Gertrude rode into town for her weekly supplies and encountered, outside the dry goods store, a woman she recognized from a distance as someone she had seen at church twice but not spoken to. The woman was perhaps 30, with a kind face and intelligent eyes, and she introduced herself as Clara Whitfield, the wife of the town doctor. "I hope you'll forgive me for speaking directly," Clara said, with the manner of someone who generally did speak directly and had developed a polite formula for prefacing it. "But I wanted to tell you that Theodore Doyle is one of the finest men in this county, and I've known him since he arrived." Gertrude looked at her. "I'm not certain why you're telling me this," she said, though she had a clear and immediate sense of exactly why. Clara smiled. "Because he looks at you the way my husband used to look at me before he had the sense to say anything about it," she said. "And because you strike me as the kind of woman who might talk herself out of something good if no one points out that she's doing it." Gertrude was briefly, unexpectedly silent. "He hasn't said anything," she said finally. "No," Clara agreed. "He wouldn't. Not until he was certain it wouldn't make things uncomfortable for you if you didn't feel the same way. That's the kind of man he is." Gertrude looked at the middle distance of the main street for a moment, at the dust and the horses and the wide blue sky above the ridge. "I need to think," she said. Clara nodded. "Of course you do," she said. "Just don't think so long you miss something worth having." She turned back toward the dry goods store and left Gertrude standing in the bright May sunshine with a feeling she was not sure she had a name for yet, though it had some of the qualities of standing at the edge of something and looking down, and understanding that the only way forward was through. She returned to the homestead that afternoon and spent the evening at the kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her, and the lamp burning, and her coffee going cold, while she sat with the thing she had been carefully not examining for approximately 6 weeks, and examined it honestly. She was in love with Theodore Doyle. She was not entirely sure when this had happened. It had not happened in a single moment, which was perhaps why she had been so successful at not noticing it until now. It had happened in the accumulated weight of every morning he had arrived with his quiet competence and his genuine attention, and his absolute refusal to treat her as anything other than an intelligent adult who was entirely capable of managing her own life. It had happened in the way he asked questions and listened to the answers and remembered what she had said the previous week and built on it. It had happened in the fence mending and the field plowing and the evenings on the porch and the legal documents spread across the kitchen table and the moment in the doorway during the dust storm when he had looked at her with something he had quickly and carefully put away. The problem was not whether she loved him. The problem was that she had been wrong before, and the wrongness had cost her not just the man but a year of her life spent in the tedious, dispiriting process of recovering from someone who had not meant what she thought they had meant. She had rebuilt herself after that with considerable effort, and she was not interested in the possibility of having to do it again. But Clara Whitfield had said something that was sitting in the back of her mind with more weight than she wanted it to carry, which was about the difference between thinking carefully and thinking yourself out of something good. She closed the notebook. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed and spent a considerable portion of the night staring at the adobe ceiling in the dark. The following morning was a Sunday, and Theodore arrived at the homestead in the early afternoon because they had agreed to go over the latest correspondence from the county clerk together. He came in his usual way, tying his horse at the post outside and knocking at the door frame rather than the door itself, which she had noticed and privately appreciated as indicative of a man who was careful about the boundary between being welcome and assuming welcome. She put the coffee on and set the papers on the table, and they settled into their usual positions across from each other. And for a while things were entirely as they always were, businesslike and focused, and comfortable in the particular way that she had come to recognize as one of her favorite states of existence. The legal situation was progressing well. Fitch's lawyer had filed a response to Judge Alderman's inquiry that Alderman had, according to his own letter to Theodore, described in private as remarkably thin. Theodore expected a ruling within the month. "You'll have clear title to the full property," he said, without any encumbrance from Fitch's claim. She looked at the letter in his hand and then at his face. He was looking at the letter with his usual focused expression, the one that suggested he was processing multiple considerations simultaneously and organizing them into a coherent sequence, and the afternoon light was coming in through the repaired windows at an angle that caught the planes of his face with a clarity that made her suddenly, acutely aware of him as a person in a way that was entirely distinct from the businesslike awareness she had been maintaining. "Theodore," she said. He looked up. She intended to say something measured. She had planned in the small hours of the previous night to approach this with the same methodical care she brought to everything else, to say something that acknowledged the situation without committing to more than she was certain of, to open a conversation rather than to declare a position. What she actually said was, "I think you should know that I have been having considerable difficulty maintaining a professional perspective on this situation for approximately 6 weeks." He was very still. "Which situation?" he said, and his voice was careful in a way she had not heard before. She looked at him steadily. "This one," she said, "us, whatever this is." He set the letter down on the table between them. He looked at it for a moment as though gathering something, and then he looked at her. "Gertrude," he said, and the way he said her name was different from every other time he had said it, less formal, as though the name itself meant something more specific now. "I want to be honest with you. Please," she said. "I have not been professionally indifferent to this situation either," he said, "for considerably longer than 6 weeks." She sat with this for a moment. "You didn't say anything," she said. "No," he agreed, "because you'd come here to build something and I didn't want to be a complication in that. And because I knew what had happened in Santa Fe, and I wanted to be certain that I wanted to be sure that if I said anything it was because it was real, and not because the situation made it convenient." She looked at him for a long time. "Is it real?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation, which was the most direct thing she had ever heard him say. She stood up from the table and walked around it and stood close to him, close enough to see the fine texture of his expression, the careful attention he was giving to not moving, to not closing the distance she had not yet indicated she wanted closed. "Then I'd like you to say something," she said. "Thing you've been not saying." He looked at her. His eyes in the afternoon light were very green. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you for quite some time. I didn't know how to say it in a way that gave you a way out if you didn't feel the same, and you deserved a way out if you wanted it. She had not known until this moment how much it would matter to hear it said with that particular quality of honesty. Not performed, not polished, not arranged into a more persuasive form. Simply true. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was the first time she had touched him deliberately and with intention, and she felt the slight involuntary exhale of his breath against her palm. "I love you as well," she said. "I have been arguing with myself about it for 6 weeks. Did you win the argument?" he asked. "Evidently not," she said. He brought his hand up to cover hers, still holding it to his face, and looked at her with an expression that had shed every layer of careful neutrality, and was simply what it was, which was a man looking at a woman he loved without any attempt to be anything other than exactly that. He kissed her then, gently and carefully, the way he did everything, but with a thoroughness that made it absolutely clear that the carefulness was not diffidence but attention. And she understood in that moment that being attended to by a person who genuinely meant it was an entirely different thing from any version of it she had previously encountered. The days that followed that afternoon had a quality to them that she had not expected, which was not the dramatic alteration she might have anticipated, but a deepening and brightening of everything that was already there. They had been comfortable before, and now they were easy. They had been honest before, and now they were open in a way that felt like setting down something heavy that you had not quite realized you were carrying. He was still at the homestead most days, but the nature of his presence was different now in ways that were small and significant. He held her hand when they walked the fence line. He brought her the first wildflowers of the early summer from the creek bottom without any explanation, simply because they existed and she was near. When she was frustrated with a recalcitrant section of the irrigation channel, he did not try to take over but sat with his shoulder against hers and worked through it with her until they found the solution together. She learned more of him. She learned that he had a particular fondness for good coffee and a genuine distaste for poor whiskey, and that he could name every significant star formation visible from the Arizona territory, and had once, at age 14, walked 40 miles across a Tennessee mountain to see a map that a schoolteacher in the next county had described as the most accurate rendering of the full American continent ever printed. She learned that he laughed rarely but thoroughly, and that his laugh, when it came, was startling and genuine, and made the people around him laugh in response, reflexively and with pleasure. She told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about the 3 months after her mother died, when she had been solely responsible for running the household, because her father had retreated into a grief so deep it had made him temporarily useless, and about the particular education she had received during those months about her own capacity for things she had not known she was capable of. She told him about the way teaching had felt to her, like being part of something that would outlast her in the way that physical things could not. She told him that she sometimes woke before dawn and went outside and simply stood in the desert dark, because the scale of the sky did something to the dimensions of her problems that she found genuinely helpful. He started joining her for those before-dawn moments. He would arrive in the early dark and stand with her in the silence outside the adobe house, while the stars faded and the sky lightened through its sequence of colors, and they would sometimes talk and sometimes not, and both were equally valuable. The ruling from Judge Alderman came on a Tuesday in late June, and it was everything Theodore had predicted. Fitch's claim was dismissed with a formal notation in the record that it had been without evidentiary basis, which was judicial language for something considerably more blunt, and Gertrude's title to the full property was confirmed with no encumbrances. Theodore brought the document out to the homestead himself and laid it on the kitchen table, and she read it twice and then looked up at him with an expression that was not quite the pure relief she had expected but something more complex, which was the recognition that the thing she had come to Calico Bend to secure was now secure, and that she was still here, and that this place had become her home in ways that had less to do with the legal document on the table than with the man standing beside it. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. She stood and went to him and put her arms around him, and he held her in the particular careful, thorough way he had of doing everything physical, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself feel the full weight of what had been accomplished here, not just the legal victory but everything else, the land worked and producing, the homestead repaired and functioning, the life she had come here to build taking its shape. "Theodore," she said, her voice somewhat muffled by his shoulder. "Gertrude," he said, with a warmth she could hear clearly. "I want you to stay," she said, "not to help with the fence or the legal matter. I want you to stay because this is your home too now if you want it to be." He was still for a moment. "I want it to be," he said, "very much." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Is that a yes?" "That is an unqualified yes," he said, which was more words than he typically used on any given topic, and she understood that this was, for him, equivalent to a speech. There was, however, one more complication. And complications, she had learned, had a habit of announcing themselves at the most inconvenient possible moments. Fitch did not take his legal defeat quietly. He was not a man who had learned to accept the word no and recalibrate his expectations accordingly. Theodore had known this was likely, and he had mentioned it to her in the days following the ruling, gently and without wanting to diminish the victory. That Fitch was a man whose pride was a significant part of his operating machinery, and that having it publicly addressed by a territorial judge was likely to produce a response. The response came in the form of a conversation that Gerald Fitch had with Gertrude in front of the Calico Bend post office on a Thursday morning in early July, a public conversation conducted with great superficial pleasantness, but with an undertow that was impossible to miss. He expressed his congratulations on the ruling, which he described as a misunderstanding now happily resolved, and he expressed his continued interest in being a helpful neighbor. And then he said, with the smooth, practiced calculation of a man who had been thinking about how to say this for some time, that he hoped she would not find the management of the property too burdensome for a woman alone, and that his offer of assistance in various forms remained open, and that he very much hoped they could be friends, in whatever form friendship might take. She looked at him with the gray-eyed steadiness that she had perfected over 24 years of dealing with men who said things that meant something other than what the words appeared to mean. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I appreciate your concern, but I am not alone and I am not in need of assistance." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "Indeed, and to whom are you referring, Miss Lawson?" "I intend to marry Theodore Doyle," she said, "in September if it suits everyone involved." This was, she was aware, somewhat in advance of any formal discussion she had had with Theodore on the subject. But she also knew Theodore well enough to know that this was exactly what he wanted, and she had decided sometime around 3 in the morning 2 days previously that the most efficient way to handle both Gerald Fitch and her own persistent reserve was to simply say the true thing out loud and let everyone adjust to it. Fitch's expression underwent a series of rapid adjustments that she found quietly satisfying. "I see," he said. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "Good morning, Mr. Fitch." She was aware, as she walked back toward the general store, that she was perhaps going to need to tell Theodore about this development before he heard it from someone else, which in Calico Bend meant she had approximately 1 hour. She found him at the livery stable, predictably, and delivered the relevant information directly and without preamble. He listened with the stillness he brought to everything important, and when she had finished, there was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "September," he said. "If it suits you," she said, looking at him carefully. "I was aware I was being presumptuous. I was also dealing with a situation that seemed to benefit from a clear statement of." "September suits me," he said. "Perfectly." She looked at him. He looked at her with those creek-water eyes and the expression that had nothing of neutrality left in it. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I've been thinking about how to say it. I was waiting until the Fitch business was fully resolved so there was no question about my motivations." "Your motivations are not in question," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I wanted to be sure you knew that." She stepped forward and kissed him there in the entrance of the livery stable in the full middle of the morning, which was not something she had ever done in a public location before, and which she found she did not mind in the least. His hands settled at her waist with the gentle firmness she had come to recognize as characteristically him, holding without constraining. When she pulled back, the stable hand, a boy of perhaps 16, was staring at them with the open-mouthed attention of someone witnessing something interesting. "Mind your horses," Theodore said to the boy, without turning around, in a tone of such perfect calm that the boy immediately minded his horses. She laughed, and he looked at her with the full warmth of his face and laughed too, that rare, genuine, startling laugh that she was still not quite prepared for every time it happened, and hoped she never would be. They were married on the 15th of September 1878, in the small whitewashed church at the edge of Calico Bend, on a morning when the desert had decided to behave magnificently, the sky a pure deep blue above the red ridges, and the air carrying the particular clarity of the high desert in early autumn. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Hollis, a spare, kind man who had been marrying and burying the people of Calico Bend for 12 years and who could always tell, he would later say, the difference between a wedding that was going to hold and one that was going to be interesting to watch unravel, and he knew within the first 2 minutes that this one was going to hold. Mr. Hankins was there, and Clara Whitfield and her husband Dr. James Whitfield, and the woman from the dry goods store and the man from the feed supply, and a dozen other people who had, over the preceding months, formed opinions about Theodore Doyle and Gertrude Lawson individually, and had come to express their view that the combination was a sound one. Gertrude wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that she had altered herself, and which made her gray eyes look almost silver, and she had put her hair up in a way that Clara had helped her with the previous evening, and she stood in the entrance of the church in the morning light and felt, quite suddenly, and with great clarity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was a feeling she had not expected, and which she received with a wholehearted gratitude. Theodore was already at the front of the church when she entered, standing with his back straight and his hat in his hands, and his expression composed into a dignity that did not quite manage to conceal the depth of what was behind it. And when she walked down the aisle between the rows of wooden pews and the morning light came through the high windows in long, golden columns, and she saw his face when he saw her, she understood that she had made no mistake and that the thing she had spent 6 weeks arguing with herself about was the most correct thing she had ever done. "I do," she said, when the time came for it, and the words felt like the most honest thing she had ever said. "I do," he said, and the words in his voice had the quality of something he had been waiting a long time to say, and had not been entirely sure he would ever have the occasion to say. And the combination of the waiting and the relief and the certainty was right there in his voice, without any of his usual protective composure, and she was very glad of it. Reverend Hollis pronounced them husband and wife with a genuine smile that his professional dignity barely managed to contain, and Theodore kissed her with the same quality of attention and thoroughness that he brought to everything, and the small congregation applauded with the particular warmth of people who were genuinely happy about something. The celebration afterward was held at the Whitfield house, which was the largest private home in Calico Bend, and which Clara had prepared with a generosity that left Gertrude temporarily unable to speak when she walked in and saw what had been done. There was good food and a fiddle player named Thomas who was far better than anyone had mentioned, and there was dancing on the wide front porch in the long September evening, and somewhere in the middle of all of it Gertrude found herself in Theodore's arms moving to the fiddle music with the ease of two people who had spent enough time in each other's company to know how to move together without discussion. "Are you happy?" he said in the quiet way he had of asking things that mattered, simply and without preamble. "Yes," she said, with an honesty that matched his, "thoroughly and without reservation." He looked at her with the open expression she had first seen in the doorway during the dust storm, and which he no longer bothered to compose back into neutrality. "Good," he said. "So am I." Gerald Fitch, as it turned out, relocated to Tucson in October, having apparently decided that Calico Bend had become insufficiently accommodating to his various interests. He sold his cattle operation to a partnership of ranchers from the eastern part of the county and departed without farewell, which was the most courteous thing anyone in Calico Bend had experienced him doing, and the general reaction was a species of relief that no one articulated very loudly but everyone felt. The Lawson homestead, which had officially become the Doyle homestead on the 15th of September, continued its progress into something Gertrude had always had a clear vision of, and which was now, with Theodore's contribution of labor and judgment, and a steadiness she had come to regard as one of the most valuable things she had ever encountered, developing faster than her most optimistic projections had suggested. Theodore took on work as a land surveyor's assistant and occasional legal correspondent for the county courthouse, work that used his knowledge of the law without requiring him to be bound by a badge, and which kept him from the homestead perhaps 2 days a week, which both of them found an appropriate balance between independent work and their life together. The first winter of their marriage was a cold one by Arizona standards, which meant it was not devastating, but was certainly cold enough to require splitting a great deal of wood and maintaining the iron stove and spending a considerable portion of the evenings close together, which suited them both very well. They read to each other in the evenings, working through the books she had brought from Santa Fe and the new ones she ordered from the catalog in Mr. Hankins's store, and they talked about the books and about everything else, and the ease that had developed between them over the summer deepened into something that had no adequate name except perhaps life. The simple, sustained reality of two people choosing each other every day without drama or crisis, in the ordinary and extraordinary minutes that make up a life. In February, she told him that she believed she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, over coffee, in the same direct way she told him everything, and watched his face go through a series of expressions that traveled very quickly from careful composure through genuine surprise to something that was so entirely unguarded that she felt it as though it were a physical warmth. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Largely," she said. "Dr. Whitfield will confirm it this afternoon, but I have considerable reason to believe." He was across the kitchen and had her hands in both of his within a moment, looking at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the face of a man for whom something entirely beyond his own expectations was happening and who was receiving it with his entire self, without reservation. "Gertrude," he said, and then apparently found that her name was sufficient to the occasion. "Yes," she said, smiling at him. "Precisely." Dr. Whitfield confirmed the pregnancy that afternoon, and the news traveled through Calico Bend with the speed that all significant personal news traveled through a small town, which was to say that by the following morning Mr. Hankins knew and had already set aside a supply of chamomile tea that he suggested might help with the early discomfort, and Clara Whitfield had arrived at the homestead with practical advice and a jar of preserves and an expression of such genuine delight that Gertrude, who was not generally prone to emotional overflow, found herself embracing her friend with a warmth that surprised them both. The spring of 1879 was a good one, the fields producing well and the homestead fully functional and prosperous in the particular, solid way of a place that has been built carefully and maintained attentively. Gertrude worked through the spring planting with adjustments for her condition, Theodore beside her, and consistently engaged in the quiet negotiation of supporting her without hovering, which she appreciated and told him so. There were moments in those spring months when she would look up from the work and see him across the field or at the fence line or coming toward her with the evening coffee. And the thing she felt was so simple and so complete that it seemed almost unremarkable, which was, she had come to understand, not a reduction of love but the fullest expression of it, the state in which love had stopped being a condition to be maintained and had become simply the texture of daily existence. Their son was born in August of 1879, on a hot night when the stars were very bright and the desert was very quiet, and Dr. Whitfield worked with patient competence, while Clara held Gertrude's hand and Theodore sat in the kitchen with the aspect of a man trying very hard not to be a problem to anyone and mostly succeeding. The baby was named Edmund, for her father, a decision Theodore had suggested, and she had received with tears she had not expected, and which she did not attempt to explain, knowing he understood without explanation. Edmund Doyle was a solid, cheerful baby with his mother's gray eyes, and his father's habit of examining things with a focused, purposeful attention that made grown adults feel they were being assessed. He slept reliably and ate with enthusiasm, and had an expression of permanent benign interest in everything around him that made him a favorite of everyone who encountered him, including Mr. Hankins, who could be seen on market days carefully ignoring the fact that he was making faces at a baby in order to produce the baby's particular gurgling laugh. The three of them settled into the life of the homestead with a rightness that Gertrude sometimes, in the before-dawn quiet when Edmund was sleeping and Theodore was beside her, and the desert outside was just beginning to think about light, held in her mind like an object she could examine from all sides, because it was a real and solid thing that she had built and which would endure. The seasons turned. The fall of 1879 brought a fine harvest and a letter from Theodore's family in Tennessee, the first contact in some years, and a tentative correspondence that he pursued carefully, and with a hope she encouraged because she had learned from her own experience with her father that time was not unlimited, and that unresolved distances between people had a way of becoming permanent in ways that no one intended. His mother responded with warmth and at considerable length, and there was something in reading those letters, in seeing the relief and the cautious joy in his expression when a new one arrived, that added another dimension to her understanding of him, this man who had left and stayed away partly because going back required acknowledging a grief and a period of his life that he had never quite finished processing, and who was now, with the stability of what they had built together, ready to look at those things clearly. The following spring they made the trip to Tennessee, a journey of several weeks that involved trains and coaches, and a good deal of close quarters that she had expected to find challenging and actually found, because it was with him, quite thoroughly enjoyable. They arrived at the Doyle family farm on a May morning that was so green and wet after the desert that it seemed to her almost extravagantly beautiful, and Theodore's mother, a small, bright-eyed woman of 60 who had his same quality of stillness, looked at Gertrude and then at Edmund in her arms and then at Theodore and said, "You did very well," which was, Gertrude would later say to Clara in a letter, possibly the most efficiently complete assessment she had ever heard a person make. They stayed for 3 weeks. Theodore walked the farm with his father, a quiet man who communicated primarily in gestures and who had apparently passed this quality directly to his son. She sat with his mother in the kitchen and talked with the frankness of two women who recognized in each other a similar mode of engagement with the world, practical and affectionate and unafraid of direct speech. "He was not the same after his brother died," his mother said one morning over coffee. "He went away and we were afraid he'd stay away, not in body but in spirit. That kind of grief can do that to a person." "I know," Gertrude said. "I've seen it." "You brought him back," his mother said. Gertrude considered this. "He was always there," she said. "He just needed somewhere to put it." His mother looked at her for a long moment and then smiled in a way that was familiar to Gertrude because she had seen it before on Theodore's face in the moments when he was most himself. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." They returned to Calico Bend at the beginning of June with gifts from the Tennessee farm, jars of preserved fruit and 2 quilts, and a cutting from a rose that had been his grandmother's, which Gertrude planted against the south wall of the adobe house, and which, to the mild astonishment of several people who had opinions about what would grow in the Arizona desert, survived and eventually flourished. The rose became, in the way that small things sometimes do, a symbol of something larger than itself. Visitors would note it on the south wall of the Doyle homestead and remark on it, and Gertrude would explain its provenance. And something in the story of a Tennessee rose growing against an Arizona adobe house seemed to please people in a way that was difficult to articulate, but which had something to do with things persisting and adapting and continuing in conditions that might not seem to invite them. By the fall of 1880, the homestead had expanded considerably. Theodore had purchased the adjacent parcel to the north when its owner moved to California, and together they had extended the fence line and planted the new field and taken on 2 hands, brothers named Samuel and Lewis Crane from a family that had come west from Georgia the previous year, who lived in the small bunkhouse Theodore had built against the eastern wall of the property, and who worked with a diligence that made the expanded operation manageable. Edmund, at 14 months, was walking with great determination and falling with great frequency, and regarding both experiences with the same philosophical equanimity. He had developed a particular attachment to the horses, and would stand at the fence of the corral for extended periods making noises of evident approval, and Theodore would sometimes stand with him there with his hands on his knees, pointing out individual horses by name, and talking to his son with the complete seriousness of someone who believed that the content of what you said to a child mattered, whether or not the child had the vocabulary to fully follow it. She would watch them from the kitchen window sometimes, the 2 of them at the corral fence in the afternoon light, and feel the particular fullness of a life that had turned out to be more than she had known to hope for. "You are looking very pleased with yourself," Theodore said one evening, coming in from the corral with Edmund on his hip and a streak of dust on his shirt. "I'm looking at you," she said, "the 2 of you, at the fence." He looked at her with the open expression she loved. "You were watching from the window," he said. "I was. For how long?" "Long enough," she said, taking Edmund from him and holding her son against her shoulder and looking up at her husband with the gray eyes that had been called serious all her life, and which she could feel now were anything but. He bent and kissed her forehead and then her cheek, and then properly, while Edmund made noises of what appeared to be informed commentary. "I love you," he said, against her hair. "I know," she said. "I love you too, always." In the years that followed, Calico Bend grew and changed in the way of frontier towns that found their footing in the territorial period. The railroad brought more settlers and more commerce and eventually a second school, which Gertrude had an opinion about and expressed it, clearly and at length, at 2 town council meetings, with the result that the new school was built in the correct location and hired a teacher of appropriate qualification. Theodore, sitting in the back of the meeting room both times with his arms folded, and his expression carefully neutral, made no comment, but his eyes were very bright. She took on a minor role in the school's early operations, not as a full-time teacher, but as a regular visitor who brought books and conducted the occasional class that the permanent teacher, a young woman named Miss Patricia Holt, welcomed with the genuine gratitude of someone who recognized a mentor when they encountered one. Several of the children who learned to read in that school under those circumstances would later say, as adults, that they remembered clearly the woman with the gray eyes who brought books and spoke to them as though the words in the books mattered enormously, because she clearly believed they did. The spring of 1882 brought a second pregnancy, which Gertrude announced at the kitchen table in her usual direct manner, and which Theodore received in much the same way he had received the first, with the undisguised, complete joy of someone who had not expected life to be so generous and was receiving each increment of it with genuine gratitude. Their daughter was born in November, a fierce and vocal girl with red-gold hair that came from somewhere in the family history that neither of them could immediately account for, and which was, as Clara Whitfield said when she saw the baby, clearly doing exactly what it intended. They named her Catherine, which had been Gertrude's mother's name, and which Theodore said immediately, and without hesitation, was the right choice. Catherine Doyle announced herself to the world with a volume and persistence that contrasted comprehensively with her brother's philosophical temperament. And Edmund, who was by then 3 years old and fully ambulatory and deeply opinionated, regarded her with the complex mixture of fascination and mild territorial concern that oldest children have always regarded the arrival of siblings. Theodore handled this by including Edmund in everything, asking his opinion on the baby's welfare with the same seriousness he had always brought to conversations with his son. And Edmund's concern resolved itself within a month into a proprietorial protectiveness toward his sister that would persist, in various forms, for the rest of his life. Gertrude nursed Catherine in the evenings by the iron stove while Theodore read aloud, working through history and natural science, and whatever fiction came through on the Tucson Mail, because they had never stopped reading to each other and never would. And Edmund would sit on the rug with his small collection of rocks, arranged and rearranged in patterns of his own devising, and Catherine would regard the ceiling or her mother's face with the alert, assessing gray eyes she had inherited. And the room would be warm, and the lamp would be steady, and outside the desert dark would be enormous and full of stars, and the life they had built together would be exactly present in the room with them. Theodore looked up one such evening from the book and found Gertrude watching him over Catherine's head with the expression she sometimes had that he had never been able to fully describe, which was a species of happiness so settled and complete that it had become indistinguishable from peace. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the gray eyes that had once watched him across a general store counter with a stranger's careful assessment, and which now saw him with the thoroughness of someone who had learned every room in a house and loved them all. "I'm thinking about the first day I came to Calico Bend," she said. "Into Hankins's store with the mud on my boots and the deed in my coat, and you helped me with the crates without being asked." "I remember," he said. "I didn't know anything then," she said, "about what was coming, the legal trouble and the fields and the water rights and all of it. And I certainly didn't know." She paused, and something in the pause was the shape of the whole story between them, every conversation and every morning at the fence and every evening on the porch. "You didn't know about me," he said. "I didn't know about you," she agreed. "And now I cannot imagine not knowing." He set the book face down on his knee and looked at her with the fullness of everything he was and everything he felt, without the protective composure he had once needed and no longer required. "Neither can I," he said. Edmund looked up from his rocks. "Papa," he said, with the earnest authority of a 3-year-old who has decided that the adult conversation has gone on long enough. "What is Jupiter?" Theodore looked at his son. "Jupiter," he said, "is the largest planet in our solar system and one of the brightest objects in the night sky. Would you like to see it?" "Yes," said Edmund, with the decisiveness of a person who has never had reason to doubt that what he wanted to see would be shown to him. Theodore rose and carried Edmund to the door and opened it onto the cool November night, and held his son in his arms and pointed out the particular bright steady light above the western ridge that was Jupiter, and Edmund studied it with the focused, purposeful attention that was entirely characteristic and entirely his father's. Gertrude watched them from the doorway with Catherine in her arms and the lamplight behind her and the enormous, starful Arizona sky above them all, and felt, completely and without reservation, that she was home. Not merely in the sense of the adobe house and the fence lines and the fields she had worked and the legal title she had defended and the land that was hers, but home in the sense of the place where the particular pieces of yourself that have always existed but have sometimes been difficult to locate are all simultaneously present and accounted for. the place built not from timber and adobe alone, but from the accumulated substance of years of choosing correctly and being chosen in return, of honesty sustained through difficulty and love grown, past the point of uncertainty into the solid, breathing reality of a life shared without concealment. Calico Bend, Arizona Territory, 1882. The desert was vast and the sky was full of lights, and the rose on the south wall of the Doyle homestead was dormant for the winter but alive, as it had been since Theodore's grandmother had tended it in Tennessee, and as it would be in the Arizona springs to come. Two people who had found each other in a dusty general store and had been sensible enough, after some necessary and honest negotiation with themselves and each other, to understand what they had found, stood in the November dark with their children and their love and the whole of the life they had built around them. Theodore looked back at her over Edmund's head, and his eyes in the starlight were the color of deep creek water, and he smiled, the full and unguarded smile she had worked to earn, and which he gave her freely now without any of the care it had once required. And she smiled back with everything she was, the woman who had ridden into Calico Bend with mud on her boots and a deed in her coat, and a determination that had not wavered, not once, even when it should have. Because she was the kind of person who was constitutionally incapable of less than her full effort, and who had found, in this man and this place and this life, something worthy of exactly that. "Come inside," she said softly. "It's cold." He came inside, carrying Edmund, and closed the door on the desert dark and the stars, and the lamp was warm and the stove was steady, and Catherine was beginning to make the small, determined sounds that indicated an opinion about dinner. And Theodore set Edmund down, and came to where Gertrude stood and put his arm around her, and held her against his side with the quiet, permanent ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and intends to do it 10,000 more. "We should add another room," he said, looking at the interior of the house with the same methodical assessment he brought to every practical problem. "By spring." "We should," she agreed. "The north side, I think. Samuel and Louis can help." "The north side," she agreed, "though I want 2 windows this time, proper glass." "2 windows," he said. "Glass." Edmund had returned to his rocks. Catherine had escalated her position on the subject of dinner. The lamp burned, the stove ticked. "Theodore," she said. "Gertrude," he said, the name entirely full of everything they had become to each other. "I am very glad," she said, "that I could not answer." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them was the whole story of it, the question he had asked in the Dusty Creek saloon all those months ago, the simple and devastating, "By whom?" that had cut through the careful construction she had assembled around herself and found, in the space where her answer should have been, the truth that she had not yet been willing to name, the truth that the man she had been waiting for had been standing in front of her, watching her with creekwater eyes and asking the right question. "So am I," he said, and kissed her temple, and they stood together in the warmth of their home while the desert held its ancient silence outside, and the stars turned in their courses above the red ridges of the Arizona Territory, and the rose on the south wall waited for spring. It came, as it always did. Spring came and the rose bloomed, sending up new canes along the adobe wall in a bright, unlikely red that people would remark on for years, and the fields greened and the north room was built with 2 proper glass windows, and Edmund learned to read in the new spring, sounding out words with the focused determination of his particular character. And Catherine added walking to her repertoire, and immediately applied it to a series of investigative excursions that required constant supervision and produced great general amusement. Theodore rode into Calico Bend one April morning and returned with 2 books he had ordered from Tucson, one for Edmund and one, because the title had made him think of something Gertrude had said once about the nature of good stories, and he brought them home without ceremony and set them on the kitchen table where she found them after the morning work. 2 books and a small bunch of the early desert wildflowers from the creek bottom, because they existed and she was near. as had always been, and always would be his reason. She picked up the flowers and the books and looked at the familiar, careful handwriting on the order slip he had left tucked inside the first volume, her name in his hand, and felt the same thing she always felt, which was love in its full and daily form, not the storm of the first acknowledgment or the deep tide of the early months, but the constant, sustaining, thoroughly reliable love of a person who had chosen you with full knowledge and chose you again every morning. In the fence mending, and the field turning, and the book ordering, and the flowers from the creek bottom, in all the small and endless ways that a life is made. She put the flowers in water and opened the first book and began to read, and outside the window the spring light fell across the Doyle homestead, across the fields and the fence lines, and the rows on the south wall and the corrals where the horses moved in the warm morning air, and the life that had been built here, piece by careful piece, by two people who had each come to this desert with different purposes, and found, in the combination of their presence, something neither had known to plan for, was exactly as it appeared, full and real and lasting and good, thoroughly, without reservation and in every direction good.